Chapter 2. "I'm fine," groused James as Gabe and Marshall maneuvered his frail 77-year-old frame onto a chair in a private room of the funeral parlor.
"It's all the drugs the doctor has me on. Every time I go for a checkup, he puts me on another set of pills. The man is a quack."
"Your doctor is fine," countered Dorothy as she followed Parker into the room and shut the door. "Why don't you just tell the truth?"
"What do you mean, tell the truth?" asked Gabe with a frown. "What is going on, Mom?"
Dorothy took a seat in the chair Marshall provided beside James. She turned to her husband before narrowing her eyes. "It is past time to tell them, James."
"Now, Dottie,"
he muttered before capitulating with a sigh after being on the receiving end of her significant gaze.
"You all might as well sit down, boys. It's not good."
Gabe tried not to scowl over the fact that their father still called him and his brothers boys, despite the fact that they had been managing the family business for years and were quite grown adults. The old man never seemed to realize his kids weren't children anymore. Parker lined up some chairs, and they took a seat, waiting to hear what their family patriarch would have to say.
"I'm dying," stated James badly. "It's the cancer. The doctors have done everything they've been able to do, and now it's a done deal. I don't have much time left, so I suppose the next funeral will be mine if one of my fool brothers doesn't beat me to it."
"How long have you known?" a stunned Gabe questioned as Dottie slipped her hand into James's pale and gnarled one. 8 years. Dottie's reply was quiet. "We've been battling it 8 years.
"The disease is one." James cleared his throat. "It has spread everywhere." "Are you absolutely certain?" asked Parker. "Perhaps one of the cancer centers can do something. Have you checked with them?" "We own the best doctors," James declared hotly. "We run hospitals, or at least your brothers and I do. Maybe you do some work when you're not surfing."
Parker snapped his mouth shut with an audible click. He leaned back in his chair, resolutely saying nothing, to be drawn into the old argument which existed between father and son.
"How long?"
Marshall tried to deflect James's ire from Parker.
"Did the doctors give you an estimate?" "They did. I was supposed to croak 4 years ago."
James had a cynical laugh.
"I guess you could say I'm past my expiration date."
"That's not funny, Dad." Gabe automatically responded to the joke made in bad taste.
"No one said it was," he snapped back.
Parker muttered something under his breath as Gabe ran a hand through his hair in frustration. James was a prickly man, and today he was angrier than his usual self. While Gabe understood it was likely from his embarrassment at collapsing in front of a crowd of people, it didn't excuse his father's behavior. James had never liked to be seen as weak.
"I've talked to the lawyers," suddenly announced James. "I have had Ramsley Hospital and Medical Corporation cleared of the investigation with the FBI. We've paid our fine for the initial money laundering I did when I was young and stupid before I told David I wouldn't put the company at risk anymore. It's all been dealt with, so none of you will have to worry about it after I'm gone."
"When did this happen? You were involved?" wondered Gabe. This was the first he had heard about the matter, and it bothered him that his dad hadn't confided in him before. Gabe was head of the operations for the company chain, and should have been informed.
"When you boys were born and Dottie put her foot down."
James had a racking cough.
"I married a good woman. She knew David was a time bomb, and we needed to distance ourselves from the mess he was making."
"Doesn't the FBI want to charge you for the money laundering of the drug money?" asked Marshall.
"They already have. I'll plead guilty when the time comes and pay the applicable penalties," replied James. "I went to them and turned myself in shortly after I learned the cancer had won. I'm going to my grave with a clear conscience. In return, I have a reduced sentence in a minimum security prison that also has a good palliative care program. I regret I will have to leave your mother, and that I had to destroy my brothers' lives in the process of coming clean. Perhaps they'll learn from their mistakes and be a better men."
"You started this whole investigation," surmised a grim Gabe, wondering how the other Ramsleys were going to react once they learned the truth.
"Yes. To keep Ramsley Hospital and Medical Corporation intact. To save your boys' inheritance if you can manage to inherit it," nodded James in satisfaction. What is that supposed to mean? Parker frowned over James's wording. If we can manage to inherit it. I have instructed the lawyers to cut you off, James informed them with some satisfaction. Each of you pull a salary from the company. That is done. Your lavish lifestyles are done. Your net worth is essentially less than middle class now. You no longer can count on inheriting part of my kingdom. I'm kicking each of you out of the condos I bought for you. You have 30 days to vacate. Good luck on those ridiculous car payments of yours, Parker. The three men stared at their father in astonishment. Why? Gabe privately wondered if the cancer had gotten to the old man's brain. None of this made any sense to him. I built this company through hard work. James's flinty eyes hardened. I can do with my wealth whatever I want. Mostly, I want my wife to be happy, and I have got one last chance to do that. Dottie wants grandkids. So, if you want to keep your condos, cars, stuff, and inheritance, you will do as I say. Marry within the month, and you keep the condo and salary. Get your wife pregnant within the year, and you will get your inheritance on your 5th wedding anniversary. You are out of your mind. Parker got up and began to pace. Is this even legal? Marshall wanted to know. Oh, it is legal, smiled James in satisfaction. The lawyers saw to it. Is he serious? Gabe directed the question to his mother. Very, nodded Dottie. From the look on her face, it was obvious she didn't fully approve of what James was doing, but was resolute about supporting his decision. Gabe had seen the same look many times over the years, and knew his mother wouldn't budge in her role of supporting her husband. James patted her hand with his free one. It's my last gift to her. Grandbabies. What are we supposed to do? Marshall asked rhetorically with some frustration. Get married within 30 days or be poorer than you've ever been, and learn what it's like to build up your own wealth rather than spending mine, spat James. This is ridiculous. Parker's tone rose. This is not some archaic time where you can just dictate what we do with our lives. True, but there's no law that says I have to give my wealth to you boys either, James apprised him. I can give it all to the dog shelter if I want. What about Mom? Tell me you've taken care of her financially, Gabe wanted to know. Of course I have. James was indignant. Dottie shushed him. I will be perfectly fine. James has seen to everything. And you're okay with him manipulating us like this? Gabe shook his head in amazement, trying to wrap his head around what his dad was doing. You boys have had more than enough time to find someone special. You've all become stubborn old bachelors, she told them. I'm not proud of what he's doing, but I hope it will be the making of you all. The making of us? Parker was incredulous. What's wrong with how we are? Other than the fact that none of you know the value of real work, huffed James. You're arrogant, stubborn, lazy, prideful, and mostly you're all entitled. Some of it is our fault, admitted Dottie sadly. It's how we raised you. James gave a grunt of dissent. Gabe leaned back in his chair, silent and not knowing what to say. Between Nate's death, Brittany, and his father, Gabe felt the entire world had turned upside down. Parker whipped out his cell phone, his thumb tapping on the screen. What are you going to do? Chuckled James. Have your lawyers call my lawyers? Essentially, yes, Parker said shortly. I told you, it's all legal and unbreakable, repeated James. The lawyers have sewn it up shut. Took a whole team of them to do it, and you don't have the time to undo it even if you could. This is crazy. Marshall voiced what all of them were thinking. You have gone crazy. Maybe, conceded James. Maybe not. When you're married to the love of your life, you'll find out what you're capable of doing for another person's happiness over your own. I hardly think I'm going to find the love of my life in 30 days, muttered Gabe. He shoved Brittany's impromptu proposal out of his mind. There had to be some alternative. Any alternative. I need some air. Marshall abruptly stood, heading for the door. Parker followed him, talking wildly on the phone about clauses and caveats. Wow, Dad. Gabe breathed out in frustration. You really know how to go out with a bang. I like to think someday you'll be telling my grandkids what role I played in the happy marriages that ensued from this."
James smiled at Dottie.
"Or perhaps we'll be telling the divorce lawyers about it,"
said Gabe dampeningly as he rose to his feet. He didn't wait for his father's reply before heading out of the room. There was a funeral attendant waiting nearby, and Gabe ascertained from him that his brothers had chosen to go to the parking lot. Pushing open the door of the funeral home's entrance, Gabe joined them.
"I can't believe it,"
Marshall bit out.
"I can,"
Parker muttered darkly as he ended the call, shoving his cell phone back inside the breast pocket of his suit.
"He's always trying to run our lives and make us dance to his own tune. This is one last attempt to meddle by the old man." "What did the lawyer say?"
Marshall wanted to know. Parker had a short, bitter laugh.
"It's ironclad. Dad already sent out copies to our lawyers, hired them to give suggestions so they wouldn't be able to argue it. He literally turned our own lawyers against us." "Isn't that a conflict of interest?" questioned Marshall. "Apparently my lawyer was delighted to give his input." Parker was sarcastic. "It's impenetrable. We're officially screwed. The countdown begins as soon as Dad informed us of what he's done, so we literally have 30 days to get wed or walk away from our jobs and our inheritance."
Marshall eyed his oldest brother.
"You are being very quiet, Gabe."
Gabe ran a hand through his hair, frustrated.
"As much as I would like to thumb my nose at him and walk away, I find I don't like the thought of being poor. Nor do I want to give up my stake in the company. I've worked hard to establish myself here. I like what I do. And in this economy, getting a similar position could take years." "So, who is the lucky lady?" asked Parker in a flippant tone. "No idea."
Gabe ignored the fact that he had been proposed to within the last hour.
"Hey, guys."
Max popped open the door of the funeral home, raising an eyebrow at them.
"Is your dad okay?" "He's officially gone insane," Parker supplied the answer. "Flipped his lid. Wacko. Belongs in the mental ward." "Dad is dying of cancer, but is otherwise his normal self."
Marshall frowned at Parker.
"It's complicated," sighed Gabe.
Max paused for a moment, noting the tension between his cousins, not quite certain how to digest their words.
"Maybe we should go talk about this later? Right now there's a funeral that needs to happen for Nate's wife and siblings. If you could come inside, we could get started."
Gabe shared a look with Parker and Marshall. None of them were happy about the situation, but Max was right. Now was not the time to deal with their father's ultimatum.
"Let's help Mom and Dad back to their seats and put off any discussion about this until tomorrow."
His brothers grimly nodded in agreement, and they all followed Max back into the funeral chapel, none of them noticing Agent Kepler, as he calmly took a notebook out of a pocket in his suit jacket while leaning against a tree. His icy blue eyes narrowed as he scribbled something in his notes. When he was finished, Kepler put the notepad and pen away, folding his arms as he patiently waited. Throughout the funeral, Gabe's mind was distracted by the ultimatum their father had dictated to him. He had never felt the urge to get married before. In fact, it was quite the opposite. Most of Gabe's relationships were short and uncomplicated. When a woman started suggesting rings or more, he ended it. Gabe liked his life the way it was. Plus, many of his friends and business colleagues were divorced, sometimes more than once. What made a marriage last? Sure, his parents had been married for a long time, but things were different in this day and age. Now, people were fickle. They were always searching for some notion of Hollywood love, which Gabe wasn't sure existed. Some people seemed to get along better than others in marriage. An example would be how his cousins were doing in their relationships. But there were many others that didn't. Max swore that true love existed, and he had found it. What sort of difference was there between true love and love? Gabe frowned. It was all ridiculousness, in his opinion. He liked to deal with facts, numbers, and corporate problems. He had never liked to deal with people's feelings. They were complicated and messy. In his experience, someone was always bound to get hurt. Marriage wasn't the solid institution everyone seemed to think it was. One thing was for certain. Gabe wasn't about to lose his position in the company, which he had worked so hard to get. People might think he had been given the job because he was the owner's son. James had made certain Gabe had jumped through extra hoops just to prove he was worthy. Nor was he going to lose out on his inheritance. Why his father couldn't have already given them their shares, like how his uncles had already done for their sons, Gabe didn't know. It was frustrating. The old man had them over the proverbial barrel. Gabe resolved to ignore the issue until a more appropriate time, trying to concentrate on the eulogy being given about his cousin Nate. How was it that Nate was gone? In his mid-40s, in excellent shape, a health food junkie, and a man who appeared to be everything healthy, Gabe wondered at how his cousin could have had a heart attack so young and suddenly passed, leaving behind 2 boys and a wife. Nate had everything. He was charming, driven, healthy, a family man, successful in his work, rich, admired, and it was all taken away in one instant. Gabe glanced at Cora, who was pressing a tissue to her eyes. Was it smart to attach oneself to another person? They could die or divorce. They could leave, and then what happened? Gabe frowned. He had been the recipient of far too many of his friends asking him for help to drown their sorrows over breakups and divorces. The guys complained during marriage, and complained afterward. Gabe just didn't see the point in being married to someone. As for kids, Gabe didn't have much experience with them. He remembered being one, and he had noticed some of his cousins had procreated an alarming amount, begging the question of why anyone would want 4 or 5 little humans running around. Kids were messy, noisy, and broke things. They interrupted well-thought-out routines. Gabe didn't expect to have kids. He had always thought Parker would accidentally get someone pregnant, something which hadn't occurred unless his brother had kept it very quiet. And as for Marshall would be the type to get married and have 2 kids. He would be good at being a dad and a husband. Gabe didn't think for a moment he had it in himself to be a good dad or husband. Gabe didn't know the first thing about being a father. His long hours at work would be detrimental to a marriage. His father was wrong. Forcing them to do this was a mistake. Gabe knew there was no point in trying to talk the stubborn fool out of it. James would never capitulate. Either they would fall in line with what their father had demanded, or they were out of the family business. Gabe quickly calculated what he had in savings and investments. It wasn't near enough the amount of funds he needed to keep up the lifestyle he was used to. There really was no alternative. He was going to have to get married. Married within a month, and pregnant within a year, Gabe corrected himself grimly. What he needed was a sensible plan, he told himself. He would create a list of respectable potential brides and select the best woman to fit his needs. Someone who wasn't demanding, from a proper family, who would be grateful to be his wife. When the baby came, and it would only be one baby, Gabe thought firmly, then they would get a competent nanny. Perhaps even 2 nannies. Whatever it took to make sure Gabe's life continued in a smooth and predictable manner. Comforted by the thought, Gabe forced himself to pay attention to the proceedings around him, only to find that it was time for the pallbearers to rise. Regretful of his lapse of concentration, Gabe rose to his feet, following the others to their pre-assigned places by the casket. As they lifted the coffin onto their shoulders and proceeded down the aisle, Gabe briefly wondered why the funeral hadn't been held in a church. When they were kids, the Ramsley family often had attended services on special occasions. Some of the families had been a little more strict than others when it came to frequency of worship. Gabe supposed Nate had fallen away from the practice. So, too, had Gabe, if he were honest with himself. If he was going to get married and have a child, he should probably continue the tradition. The men carefully assisted in putting the casket in the hearse before the short drive to the cemetery. Police had shut down the roadway, and security had been placed at the funeral home and the cemetery. None of the family wished to come in contact with the press today. The line of limousines drove along the paved roadway, sandwiched between green rolling hills, rows of graves, and tastefully placed trees. They bypassed these, traveling to the back of the cemetery, where a large set of plots had been purchased decades ago for the use of the family by their grandparents. It already was a resting ground for relatives who had passed. Now Nate would be laid to rest with them. Gabe tried not to think about it, as he took his place as pallbearer once again. Everyone died. Likely the next funeral would be for his father. What would life be like without his dad wanting to go over the weekly reports? Assisting in placing the casket on the lowering device, Gabe and the other pallbearers then took their places with their immediate families. Standing with his brothers, Gabe reflected his parents, plus his aunts and uncles, were getting older. They had been very blessed so far not to have many funerals. Across from the family, Gabe could see Brittany and Naomi Crawford standing with other friends of the family. Naomi was whispering something, and Brittany looked a little pained at her mother's gossip. Everyone knew Naomi Crawford was a hard woman with a cutting tongue. It probably explained a lot about Brittany's occasionally odd behavior. Gabe's Aunt Mary had once called the Crawford family vulgar upstarts. They were now on the fringe of acceptability, thanks to Brittany's father, Erwin Crawford. He was in prison for aiding and abetting David Ramsley with his plans to escape the country. Somehow, other than the ongoing FBI investigation, the Ramsley family was managing to weather the storm well, probably due to the programs the family had been putting in place to garner good press and turn public opinion in their favor. Ramsley Pharmaceuticals had lowered drug prices and their profits while funding research on treatment for several diseases. Ramsley Insurance Corporation had given a base discount to all the company's clients. Ramsley HMC were taking on more pro bono work and had changed their payment plan system to be more charitable toward lower-income families, much to Marshall's delight. Parker had spearheaded the project, much to James's grumbling, but the move had garnered free press, which had eventually resulted in a better bottom line as more people sought out surgeries and medical treatment at Ramsley HMC. As for Ramsley Hotels, they were a luxury chain whose reputation hadn't been rocked by the scandal, despite Uncle Oliver's involvement. In fact, Nate had insisted the whole episode added a certain cachet to staying at one of the Ramsleys. The Crawfords hadn't fared as well. Rumor had it Erwin Crawford's funds had been frozen, leaving Naomi with a sea of bills and nothing to pay them with. Brittany was in business with her best friend Tara. Gabe didn't know what they did, but it was said Brittany had done well for herself. Probably she was now propping up her mother's extravagant lifestyle. It would probably have been polite to inquire about her father earlier, but Gabe had been too shocked by her marriage proposal. He had no intention of pursuing it further. Brittany was not the one for him. She was like an annoying gnat which kept circling. The past few years with minimal contact had been a blessing. Who knew what was going on in her mind? She was the most unpredictable, infuriating, irritating woman he had ever met. No one managed to make him feel the way Brittany Crawford did. Turning his attention back to the proceedings, Gabe watched as the casket was lowered into the grave. Slowly, people began to disperse as the event was over. Henry helped Cora to her feet, drawing her arm through his as they made their way back to the cars. Cora's sons trailed them, both beside their Uncle Ben, who had a hand on each of their small, thin shoulders. A man approached Addison. Gabe recognized him as Lincoln Waters. Lincoln owned a chain of luxury hotels which were in direct competition with the Ramsley chain. There was a rumor Lincoln and Nate had been so hostile towards each other that Nate had ended up throwing Lincoln out of one of the Ramsley hotels and issuing a no trespass order. Yet now the man was here, gently offering a condolence to Addison, who appeared to be listening. Until Garrett came forward between the two, growling at Lincoln. "You shouldn't be here." "I am paying my respects," a deliberately calm Lincoln replied. "My sincerest apologies on your loss." "You aren't welcome here," repeated Garrett loudly. "Garrett," hissed Addison, "you're making a scene." Gabe noticed a glint of light from a lens behind the trio. Someone was on the lawn, recording from afar so as to not have security spot them. He quickly approached his cousins. "There's a reporter filming.
I suggest we all just go to our cars.
Garrett gave Lincoln a last glare.
Come, Addison.
Addison gave Lincoln's hand a squeeze. Thank you, Mr. Waters. The flowers were lovely.
You're welcome, Miss Ramsley, he responded with a nod of respect. Addison, growled Garrett.
My brother calls. Addison had an apologetic smile before following Garrett toward the line of cars.
Mr. Waters, Gabe said in respect, my apologies for my cousin's behavior.
No apology needed, replied Lincoln as he watched Garrett and Addison get into one of the limos.
Well, Nate, Garrett, and I have had our differences. I would never have wished this upon Nate. It's understandable Garrett would be distressed today. He and his brother were close. That is very charitable of you, observed Gabe as he took the other man's measure.
He held out a hand in greeting.
Thank you for coming. Gabriel, isn't it?
Lincoln shook his hand.
Pleasure to meet you.
Gabe nodded, then joined the Ramsley family as they left the graveyard. Down the row of cars, he spotted Brittany helping her mother into a vehicle. He could hardly believe just a few hours ago she had proposed to him. Catching her eye, Gabe frowned before entering the limo with his brothers. If you enjoyed this chapter of Convincing Him, Book 9 of the Ramsley book series, look for Chapter 3 coming soon. You can also subscribe and hit the little bell so that you'll get notifications every time I drop one of the chapters of my books. Happy listening.